Thank you for your warm welcome. I was really struck when Stephanie called and asked if I would do something on Hazen Pingree. I happen to really like Hazen Pingree, and nobody ever asked for Hazen Pingree. So I was very excited. And this is actually the first time I've done this. So if I go too long, just do this and say, or just walk out, and I'll catch on. I don't know. Being from Ann Arbor, people usually say I speak way too fast and way too much. So if you have a question, or if there's something you want to comment about, or if you have something that's interesting to say, just say it. You can raise your hand if you want, but you can just say it and interrupt me. So I have no problem with that at all. Has anyone here actually heard of Hazen Pingree? Do you know who he is? Good, good. So some people have not, and some people have. Hazen Pingree is mostly a mayor and only a one-term governor, and not a very successful governor. So he kind of got in under the wire on the governor series, I think. But he's still a great man, and I think he's well worth talking about. Hazen Pingree was always quoted. He was kind of a mouthy guy. He talked a lot. And this is one of my favorites from his book, Facts and Opinions, and it's always the big thief who shouts the loudest about the little thief. And that's some truth to that, which is nice, but also it's typical Pingree. He's sort of cynical about people. And he liked people, but he also met a lot of people who he was not really fond of and thought they were crooks. So that's just perfect for him. There he is. He's very resplendent, Victorian. He's considered by a group of American scholars, they surveyed him, among the 10 best not governor, but mayors in U.S. history, all of U.S. history. So he's quite good. He did 4 terms as mayor of Detroit, starting in 1889, and 1 term as Michigan's governor in 96. Pingree was a progressive, and that was who really, in the big picture, he moved Detroit from a 19th century mentality and social structure to a 20th century. And really, if he hadn't been there, it would have taken much longer and been more agonizing. But what he saw in the 19th century was he called it a rigged economy. It was a 19th century with a rigged economy that favored by far what were called silk stocking people, the wealthy people, and was also run by these nasty political machines that you always hear about. And they were just terrible. And he moved it over to a more publicly focused, more open, and better city government. This is some of his accomplishments. I'll go through them really quick. He was just astounding. He got private corporate trusts to lower the price of natural gas, telephone rates, and streetcar tickets. He reconstructed the Detroit sewer system. He started the first publicly owned transit system. He improved Detroit streets, considered among the worst in the U.S. He started the first public parks, public schools, and public bathhouses. He began the city's first city-owned lighting company. These were moving from privately owned to publicly owned. He forced down the rate for river ferries. He implemented more equitable tax policies. I'll talk a little bit about that. He pushed through electric-powered trolley cars. They were horse-powered. He initiated competitive bidding. He started urban farms for the poor, which today have become a big deal in Detroit. And they made him a national hero because of that. He eliminated old toll roads. And even on there yet, he initiated for many people the 8-hour workday. So he was only there for less than 10 years, and he did just a tremendous amount of work. Progressivism began in 1890, and it was an offshoot of the temperance movement and other things like that. It went on from 1890 to 1920, but it really ended at World War I. When World War I hit, everything kind of, the idea of progressivism stopped in a way. It was picked up, some scholars say, again by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but really the whole movement with all these people. Most of the people in this movement were college educated, very idealistic. It focused on everything from public health, food safety, education, cleaner cities, you know, the beautiful city they talk about, this was all part of this movement to try to improve life. On the national level, it began really with Teddy Roosevelt and was picked up by Taft, and then finally Woodrow Wilson was also a proponent of this movement. On the urban level, this is where they made a lot of impressions and made a lot of news, was Grover Cleveland from Buffalo. He was mayor of Buffalo before he was president. Tom Johnson from Cleveland, and then our own Hazen Pingree. And they focused, just as the others, but they focused on this antitrust movement. There was a lot of things they made improvements on, roads improvements and all kinds of things. To understand where Pingree comes from, I want to just tell you where Detroit was at in 1889, so you can see how he operated. The population of Detroit was 205,000. Only 42,000 people were Native Americans. In other words, they were born in the United States of American parents. 78,000 of the population had foreign parents. They were born in the States, but their parents were from overseas. And 80,000 were foreign born. So it was a real mix of people, and very dynamic. Germans dominated. Prior to the Germans, the Irish dominated, but the Germans dominated everything. They had 8 newspapers and were quite politically active. Irish influence was waning, and they fought bitterly with Germans in Common Council. And then finally, the Polish were coming in strongly, and were essentially, the Germans despised them, and they were not really well received, but gradually all this changes. That was another version of progressivism. Progressivism is acceptance of immigrants. Up until then, it had been this rigid pushing back. The dominant industries of '89 were railroad cars, stoves, cigars and tobacco, pharmaceuticals, paint and varnish, musical organs, shoes, and white lead. No cars, as you can see, but there was a bicycle industry that was starting to pick up. This was kind of the form of mass transit. These are called horse cars. And these were rail cars. These were on rails, and they're drawn by horses through the city, and they're very common across the country. This is a fire department of 1889. These men, I don't know if anyone knows Detroit very well, but if you go down to the Renaissance Center and then you go east on Jefferson, one of the streets you cross is St. Aubin. It's a small street. That was the St. Aubin farm. That was their strip farm that went down through there up to Hamtramck. And these brothers are St. Aubins of that family, the 2 men on top of the wagon. I met their great-great-grandson about last year when I did an article on the French Canadians still living in Detroit. And he's a character. Most people say, we want to open a museum and have all the displays. And he says, no, we want to open the Moulin Rouge and have dancing girls and all this kind of thing. So, okay, he was great. This is the police department. This is a shot looking up Woodward. If you look just past that church, you'd see Comerica Park. So it's not there yet, but this is our fine force of about 2,500 policemen. This was the biggest hotel in Detroit called the Russell House. And actually there was another big one, but this was where everybody went to make deals and all that kind of stuff. This was a police station at Trumbull in Michigan, so it was right near old Tiger Stadium. It's not there, no. These are boys on the street. There were about, having boys on the street was a big problem in Detroit. There were about 2,500 boys that delivered newspapers on the street. This was taken from a survey, this wonderful survey done by the YMCA on boys living in the streets and how they do it and what they know and all that. It's very interesting. This is a picture of them waiting for theater. This is a beautiful kind of winter picture on Woodward Avenue. Did you want to look at that again? Isn't that pretty?
What church is that?
I don't know. I can't figure that out.
I don't know the name of it, but I recognize it.
I do too. I recognize it too. And it said Woodward Avenue, and even still I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe it might be something else. Huh? I don't know about that, but maybe. It looks more like something on like Farnsworth, or it looks like a cross street to, I don't know. But anyway, they said Woodward. It's still pretty. It's Detroit, I can guarantee that. This is Arbeiter Hall, and Arbeiter Hall was over near Gratiot, and it's where the Germans hung out. And yeah, right. Worker Hall is what it means. And it's where all the crazy people were too, that like socialists and anarchists, and they had all these meetings and union meetings. And it was a really wild place, but they also had lots of fun dances, and people would dance all night and to German music and drink beer illegally and eat hot dogs. And there's all these articles about how much fun that was. This is how the city was divided. These are the wards. This is Woodward. I can't see. I keep doing this. See, this is Woodward. There's Woodward, as you can see. And then the wards go back and forth away. And each ward elected 2 aldermen, two representatives. And they were scattered out throughout the city, of course. The city was much smaller. It was less than 80 square miles. So today it's 138 square miles.
So Woodward, the way he did it, anyway.
Yeah. What?
Woodward.
Oh, the man?
Yeah.
Well, if you look down below, this is like Grand Circus Park, and that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
in the whole,
well, those things are all part of Woodward Scheme. But the wards aren't. That had nothing to do with Woodward. That was much later.
Did the wards follow the strip farms?
No, it looks like it, doesn't it? Now they're way too wide. Strip farms are only about 300 feet wide. They're real narrow and real long, like 2 or 3 miles long. It was a pain if your neighbor wouldn't let you cut through. You know, you have to walk around. But yeah, no, they're too wide. But that's good. That's the impression you get too. Most aldermen were German saloon owners. Okay, so there were 32 total. There were 16 wards and 32 aldermen. Most of them were saloon owners. Few Detroiters knew who the candidates were. They'd in their saloon, they'd set up who the candidate was going to be, and then they'd bring in people. Okay, you're going to vote for them. It was a total system. And at the sessions, as many as 200 people would go to these common council meetings, and they would blow horns and fight and throw stuff and ring cowbells, and it was chaos. It was just a real zoo. And council's only concerns were with contracts, rewarding jobs for their friends and allies, and hammering their enemies. And I mean, they hammered literally, they were fighting. When Pingree got inaugurated, 7 of the aldermen were arrested for bribes. Everyone smoked cigars. So you can imagine the atmosphere of this place. It's just choked with smoke, they said. Council was ruled by one guy, basically, and his name was the boss Chris Jacob. He was the king of the 5th Ward, and he was the man. He was this big, strong German guy with this thick German accent, and he bent rules. He closed down the thing. The Supreme Court of Michigan said, you can't do that. He didn't care. He had a violent temper. One time, a guy accused him of using floaters, which were homeless people, to vote for him. So they'd bring in these homeless guys, and they would vote. So he took the guy, and he punched him out, and he threw him over a stairway banister. And the guy fell down the stairs and busted his neck. He was mean. And like I say, he had this thick German accent. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the guy. I have pictures, but I can't get them to load. This lovely guy, he was alderman for the 1st Ward, which was a slum called the Potomac. It went right along the river. The Potomac. It was named after, it's kind of a long story. It was named after a Civil War song, All Quiet Along the Potomac. And in fact, that song affected a movie called All Quiet Along the Western Front. They took it from the Civil War. But his slum, the slum was called the Potomac. He was a flop house owner, and his name was Billy Boucher. He called himself the Foist of the Foist. He was the top of the 1st Ward. This is James Vernor's drugstore, you know, Vernor's Pop, and this is where he held his drugstore, and he was the inventor of that, of course. And he was a very good alderman. Not all of them were bums. Here's Mr. Vernor, and he was an alderman for many, many years and was highly respected. Now, another thing that Pingree had to face were called trusts, and these trusts, this is from a cartoon magazine called, or from a magazine called Puck, which was popular in the 19th century. And that knight there represents, he's supposed to be a knight of, he's a trust. And all these little guys, these little jokey fellows are all progressives. So Pingree is over here, that's Pingree. And there's Teddy Roosevelt, I don't know if you can see him. There's Johnson down here. And these are all guys trying to fight this trust, and they are not being very successful. That's sort of the point of it. But that was a big problem for Pingree, these trusts. And these were all very wealthy. The trusts were started by a generation before his money. So they started with lumber money, or what they used to call capitalists, or people from New York that invested in the infrastructures for the railroads, you know. That's what trusts were for. Now we use the government to do that, but in those days when there was not much government, they would go to New York, to the financing centers, and say, we want to build a railroad, but we're just poor Michigan, we don't have very much money. So they would put the money up to build all of the tracks, and it was way beyond what Michigan could afford. The problem was, the trusts, you couldn't get rid of them. They would give them 30-year franchise, another 30-year franchise, and they would stop making improvements. So the thing deteriorated, but they're still raking in tons of money. And it was just a terrible burden. In Detroit, the trusts were run by, these are three people that affected Pingree, but this is Senator James McMillan. He was a US senator and one of the top senators in the country. He was invested in the railroads. Same with this fellow, James Joy. He was invested in the railroads as well. Joy Road's named after him. And this fellow here is George Hendry. He was from Britain and from Canada, and he and his son owned all the city lines, all those horse cars that I showed you earlier. They ended up to be implacable enemies of Pingree. They hated him. And they all met in this beautiful building called am I going too fast for you, or are you trying to take notes?
I just love the building.
Oh, I thought you were throwing up your hands in disgust. Huh?
Grandparents
Oh, were you in there?
oh, gosh, yes.
Oh, what do you mean by gosh, yes?
They were.
Oh, good, good. It's a beautiful place. They had a bowling alley and it had all these rooms, and it's still, it's for sale right now. Yeah, again, but it's it's a magnificent building, and it was, It's right on 4th Street, I believe, and it's on Cass, that's right. Fort and Cass, yes. And
The building's right behind it. It's connected by that bridge that you can see in the picture.
that's right. It was really built a little bit later, but the Detroit Club was still an entity. It was really, this building was built in 1903, but those people still gathered together. It was really an elite place. It was a beautiful place. Okay, so that's where Detroit was at. Pingree started in a little farm in Denmark, Maine, a tiny town. He started out, he hated farming. He got a job in a shoe factory cutting leather. And by the time he was born in 1840, so in 1862, he joined the Civil War with a Massachusetts regiment, Company F. And he was captured and was sent to Andersonville. And he suffered stomach ailments throughout his life because of Andersonville. In fact, some people think it killed him, that he died of those same problems. But the interesting thing about Andersonville for Pingree was there were other kids from Detroit there, and they just kept talking about how much they loved Detroit and how all the things they're going to do when they get home. And it kind of put a fever into Pingree. So by the time he was mustered out, he went back, he got out, he escaped from Andersonville by pretending to be somebody else, and he went back into the Army. So he was really a kind of a hero, and ended up going to the Appomattox courthouse and seeing the signing of Lee's surrender, or the South surrender, and all that. And he was always, his life, I'll show you some pictures later, a big supporter of soldiers and young boys. And he writes just lovingly about all these naive boys coming from New England to fight in the Civil War and being trained by these hardened veterans. And I don't think that ever changes. My dad used to talk about that too. But he came to Detroit then, 15 months later. This is actually a shot that's very blurry, but this is from around 1860. So it's a little bit later. 1860, 1870. But that's actually a water fountain there in the center of Detroit. But it's one of the oldest pictures I could find. He worked for Henry Fife, who was a shoemaker in Detroit, a big one. And Fife was fairly rich. He built the first, one of the first skyscrapers in Detroit. I don't know if you've seen it, the Fife Apartments. My two daughters love downtown Detroit, and their friends live in the Fife Apartments now, so they're very excited about this. Yeah. Oh, isn't that funny? Well, anyway, Pingree worked for Fife for a couple years, and he quit. Then he worked for this shoemaker, H.P. Baldwin, as a salesman, and he wasn't happy with that, so he got out of that and met a fellow named Charles Smith and started a vegetable business. But then Baldwin called him and said, I'm selling out, I'm out of business, we're gonna auction my equipment. So Pingree bought the equipment, the shoemaking machinery, and reworked it and was able to bring it back to life. And so he started the Pingree Shoe Company and Pingree Smith Shoes. This is a younger picture of Pingree, of course. And so in 1866, he started with 8 employees and about $1,385 capital. In 20 years, you can see how much he built it up. But he was so energetic. People were not surprised at all that he could do this. And it ended up to be the second biggest shoe company in the world. This was his factory that was on Woodward and Griswold. This was his house, so he was obviously prosperous. He was very wealthy. They made at least $1 million a year, which was a lot of money then. He was very fond of horses, and these are his children. And he was also a very snappy dresser. He was known, and people would comment, he always had these beautiful silk hats and long frock coats and stuff like that. But he was big horse lover, especially white horses. He stayed out of politics for a long time, but he was part of the Big Four. He was president of that, and they were big donors. He reached now 50 years old, so he was getting close. But many men in those days who were successful, you see it over and over, they would make their fortune, and then they would go into public office. It was a very common thing to do, to serve their fellow man after making the money. In the election of 1889, James McMillan, who I showed you earlier, was president of or head of the Republican Party. William Thompson was a former mayor and also involved the public, and James Joy was as well. So they approached Pingree and said, you know, do you want to run? It's a totally democratic city. You don't have a chance really, but you know, the way McMillan described it, he says, well, he was a friendly fellow and an honest man, and maybe that would appeal to some people. But they didn't have much hope in it. Well, Pingree got into it. He really got into it. He took this on, and he stumbled at first, but he had some people that helped him and taught him how to give speeches. He talked to the immigrants for the first time. People had never talked to immigrants. He talked to Germans. He didn't get an endorsement for the German paper, so he secretly bought a paper, put his own editor in, and suddenly he was on the front cover, and they loved him. He drank with the Irish to show that he was not a temperance man, that he was, you know, so they liked that, everybody liked that, and talked to the Poles for the first time. We had a translator, and he would go and talk to them, and nobody had ever done that. He was very friendly. Like I say, he was a big guy, and he used to call himself, I'm just old bald-headed Ping the shoemaker. That's the way he called himself. He was big like a Maine farmer, you know, he was tall and heavy. He had kind of a high voice though, and he had blue eyes, which gave him kind of a vacant look, but he was very energized, and he would be all over you, very hand-grabbing, how you doing? But if he was angry or if he felt somebody was attacking him, he was a lion. He could be ferocious. This was his famous flyer of the day, the businessman's working candidate, all that stuff. He had 5 objectives. He was elected. They're totally surprised in 1889, and he went into Common Council to talk to the boss, you know, Jacob, and in the gallery were the Republicans, actually, the people that owned the streetcars and owned all this, the streets and all the other stuff. They were always, and all the aldermen in their saloons were all waiting for him to talk. And he came in, he was not Victorian in that he would give 4-hour speech with a long introduction. He just talked right at you. Okay, here's what I'm doing. And he said he wanted to repave the streets, he wanted to repair the sewers, he wanted to force improvements, get rid of the horses, they wanted to electrify that, improve electricity rates they were getting gouged by the electricity system, and turn lighting into a public system, also they were getting gouged. And he gave them a list of people he wanted to hire to assist him. And Jacob just said, he looked at the list and just said, well, we'll think this over. And that was that. Well, he came back and he didn't take no. He takes the council to the streets. Here's what the Detroit Free Press said about the streets. The beautiful streets of our city should be paved with a material that will not rot in a few seasons and emit its filth-saturated, decayed wooden surface. The malaria is so injurious to health. The Detroit Journal I read said, I call it miles of rotting, rutted, lumpy, dilapidated paving. So it was not good. In fact, what it was in 1840, they would use cedar stumps that they would use and pound into the ground, and that formed the paving. Well, those things absorb stuff. And in fact, they absorb so much grease and nasty stuff that when men would throw their cigars down, the street would catch fire. Yeah, in the summer, it would be burning. It was terrible, and people were beginning to think they were getting malaria and stuff from these streets. They were gross. So, yeah.
I was wondering, is it possible to go back just whenever those 5 items?
Yeah, sure. Repave the streets of Detroit, so that was one thing you wanted to do. Repair the sewers. Force improvements on the horse car trolleys. Improve electricity rates. And turn lighting into a public system. Public lighting. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. He takes the aldermen into the sewer system and to show them the crumbling cement from the contractor. He turned his office into like a chemistry lab and started mixing cement to show them how the contractor was giving it to him with this terrible, terrible cement. Then at his expense, they traveled to other cities to see electric trolley cars working and how much better that was. I've got a piece coming out on Sunday online in the Detroit News on horses before cars. And the horses, there were 12,000 horses roughly when this went on, and they were responsible for 22 to 32 pounds of manure daily and 6 quarts of urine all through the city. So you can imagine how this was getting out of control. So he took some, and what happens is this boss Jacob tables or rejects every improvement he did. They said no way. And he even refused to hire his choices that he needed working. They put in their own cronies. So Pingree, though, just, okay, so this is the game we're playing. So what he does is he goes after what they used to call boodlers, and they were people taking bribes. And the most notorious of these were on the school board. So he sets up school board members with detectives in a hotel and says, okay, these are buyers, sellers, and for school equipment. And he sends them in, and in the other room he's got a stenographer listening in, spying, and taking notes. And sure enough, all the aldermen or the school board are taking bribes. And so he goes to the school board meeting, and they tell him, you're not welcome here. But he says, okay. So he reads each one's name and each one of the things they did. And then he brings in the police, and they all come in and they arrest all of them. Oh yeah, and it's this huge scandal. The newspapers are critical, but he got him out of there. 2 of them went to prison, 1 jumped bail, 1 acquitted, 1 committed suicide. It was harsh, but in looking at what he was doing, he needed some big splash thing to make things happen. But right away, a lot of people didn't like the way he was doing it. He was making waves. He continued to publicly force changes. He goes after antiquated toll road system. And his own friends run these systems, and he said, I don't care. This is not good for the city. He pushed for 8-hour workdays. He built public parks. I mean, the same way he's doing it. He's bringing in the press. He's confronting people publicly. He's embarrassing them. He's really in their face. Continues to push for city ownership of trolley cars. He gets reelected 3 times, and this is one of his, what's left of his reelection poster. They called him Brave Pingree. And then what happens in 1891 are the streetcar riots. The streetcar riots are really horrific, and they make national news. What happened was the Hendries, George Henry, who I showed you, and his son Stephen, tried to install electric system down by Springwells, which is down past Corktown. And people didn't like it. They were scared. There were sparks, and they didn't like it at all. So they said, okay, well, screw this. We're not going to do this. But they said, we're never going to do this. And people, as other cities were starting to get these electric trolleys, they just said, nope, we're staying with horses. And the consequence was these and they wouldn't keep them up. They were filthy. There were long delays. The horses had a lot of problems. And it wasn't all fun, that's for sure. So people in Detroit were becoming really ashamed of these. They were the last, they were considered the worst system in the US for a big city. So not only were there was a strike called by the workers. They were complaining because they were working 81 hours a week and they wanted to go to 72, so you can imagine. Well, the Hendries fired them instantly. Pingree Pingree's solution was he was not going to call in the army. Okay, other cities like Chicago, and they had the big Pullman strike, these major strikes. They would call in the National Guard and Army to actually shoot people and to force them back. Pingree said, "I'm not doing that. That to me is completely immoral. You know, it is wrong." So he wouldn't do it. Here's a horse cart from Fort Wayne to Elmwood. It's from 1890. Here's our George Henry. He owned originally stagecoaches, and then they moved, when trains came in, they started doing carting Carthage. They started doing teamster work, and then he got into the trolleys. So as I said, one of the last cities to have the horse-drawn trolley. There was slow, poor service, and what they would give, it was a trust. So what they would say, okay, you get the franchise non-competitive for 30 years, but you got to guarantee the price, you got to keep it up and all that. But they also said, well, Pingree said, you got to electrify these things. We can't have these horses 30 years from now. And they said, well, we'll do it, but we won't say when. So that meant they wouldn't do it. So that was a real problem. So in April 13, 1891, the railway employees were immediately discharged. The Hendries claimed, well, we have the right to discharge anyone anytime, just like they can quit anytime. That was kind of their reasoning. And thousands took to the streets. J.L. Hudson provided food for people. They weren't just workers, the whole city was out there. One of the later mayors, James Cousins, who worked for Ford, he was out there. They were all supporting these workers. And the mobs began ripping up the rails from the street and shouting, you know, kill the Canucks. That was, the Hendries were Canadian. And so Stephanic Henry went to the store and they bought revolvers and guns. And they start throwing bricks at the cars and they unhook, they take the pins out of the horses, so the horses run off and that kind of thing. And Stefan starts going crazy and shooting, and they all pull out guns and they're all pointing at him. It was getting really close. So the police say to Pingree, well, you got to call the National Guard. You got to stop this. And he said, I'm not gonna. He said, but I'll talk to the rioters. So he talked to them and calmed them down and said, go home. They didn't. They just went somewhere else. But that was the way he solved it. And what that resulted in was that the Hendries actually negotiated for the first time, went to arbitration with the strikers instead of violently submitting. And Henry wrote, the board instructs me, this is what Pingree wrote to him out of a long letter, and the board instructs me to say that the company exceeds your proposal for arbitration. So they basically won. And eventually, and not long after that, the Hendries ended up selling the whole thing to the city. It was a huge national spotlight for Pingree, who was looked as a real hero, who solved it without the violence. But he became an enemy of this man, James McMillan, who was a major stockholder of those horse cars. So he was not happy at all. In 1893, I don't know how much time I've got. Am I good or way over? Or?
Oh, no, you're okay.
Okay. 1893 was a massive depression, and there were real suffering especially from Poles and from Germans. Pingree, there was like 30% of the nation unemployed of the city of Detroit were out of work. But 50% of the Poles and Germans were out of work, and they were starting to get violent. So Pingree, this is the title page of his book, and it's actually a potato, because he became known as Potato Patch Pingree. And what he did was he said, all these Poles are all farmers. Let's give them some place to farm where they can grow their own food. And so he did that. He went around to the churches, his church and others, to collect money, and they were against it. The newspapers, this is not a good idea to have people farming. And they refused. He raised $13 from the churches and immediately wanted to revoke their tax status, their non-tax status. What he did was he took one of his horses and he sold it, and with that money they bought 400 acres of land to start these farms. And here he is breaking ground on one of the first year. They had enough money and enough stuff for 1,000 families, but 3,500 families applied. So there was a lot of need for this. Like I say, newspapers opposed it, sold his horse. The amount of produce they got, they had a surplus right away, but the grocers refused to sell it because they were afraid they were going to aggravate their wealthy customers. Ended up, Pingree toured the U.S. He was copied. He spoke to great numbers in New York City, and there were these farms grown all over the country, New York, Boston, and Chicago. So it was a huge success. But it caused more people, wealthy people, to dislike him. It was really starting to close. They were closing in on him. They forced him out of his church. They removed his bank board status. They kicked him out of the Detroit club. Oh, God. But he was moving in his mind, he was moving from a thought of charity to social justice. He saw charity, as he said, is the handmaid of economic oppression. And he was moving away from the thinking that you could solve the problems by being nice to people and giving them free stuff. You have to change the system. But this is what he said when he would run into his friends and neighbors and church members who said, it takes a lot of pluck to see your old associates pass you by without speaking and not getting disheartened and want to give up the fight. So they were really feeling social pressure from all this stuff. But the working class people loved him. And the newspapers were saying they loved him because he was making enemies of the people they hated. So Pingree at this point, he'd served 4 terms, and he thought the real problem was in Michigan's government with the railroads. He loathed the railroads. And so he thought he would run for governor. But he also, at that time, that was the time of the Spanish-American War, he was very supportive of soldiers. And here's Pingree down, he's in the middle there, with the officers at Camp Island Lake in Brighton. That's where the soldiers gathered to go off down south into Cuba. But they first would gather from all over the state there. And they were young boys, and everybody was very excited, and their parents would come in with picnic baskets, and it was a very exciting time. And Pingree would join them. He's right here in the white horse. And these are other staff men of his, and there's all these soldiers along outside of there on Island Lake. And like I said, the families would come in and be worried about their kids. These are the soldiers leaving for Tennessee and for Florida, where they would gather again and then head to Cuba. This is kind of a long quote. This is what the New York Times said about Pingree's governorship, at that time he was running is considerable anxiety is expressed even by the men who voted for him over the probability that he will use the power of his new office to put into execution the many eccentric schemes of which he is known to approve. He is said to have an insane hatred of railroads and on many social economic subjects to be far more heretical than the populist gang whose financial absurdities he opposes. And that's from the national, so you can imagine the local people were really on him. He was bringing that out of him. So what happened was McMillan in the Senate, head of the Republican Party, joined with the railroad lobby, and they were waiting for Pingree. And he was no longer in Detroit. He was now governor, and he didn't have the kind of relationships and the allies that he had in Detroit. And they just blocked everything he did. No matter what he did, they put up a block. And he was getting more and more angry and embittered. And he started doing things just really almost out of spite. He pardoned a lot of very hardened criminals that upset people very much, very controversial. But he was very loyal, still to his friends. This is Russell Alger, who was a hero of the Civil War, who was an ally of Pingrees. And in the Spanish-American War, he was the Secretary of War and sort of in charge of logistics of getting the soldiers their meals and stuff like that. Well, that hadn't been touched since the Civil War. So there was no infrastructure, and they were getting food late to the soldiers, or it'd be rotted, the meat would be rotted, and every day the soldiers are writing back, we're getting rotted meat, so the parents are starting to go crazy, and it was getting very intense, and Russell Alger was almost treated as a traitor. But he was really, he was working as hard as he could to straighten this out, but by that time he was the bad guy. And the papers at that time were all against him. But Pingree stood by him and helped him through that. But it cost Pingree everything, really. So Pingree left the governorship, and he, like I say, did controversial decisions. But his day really had passed, and he was done. So he decided to take a vacation. He had to get out of there. So he took a vacation to Africa in 1901 with his son Joe, who's down below, and two colleagues who helped him through Africa. And they started out in Egypt, and the Detroit papers would take pictures of him behind the pyramids and all that stuff. And they went down the eastern side of Africa, down to South Africa to hunt like Teddy Roosevelt. Anybody was doing this Teddy Roosevelt African hunting thing. And he was 61. And here's Joe. Joe, his son, played for U of M football. He was a football player in 1898. But Pingree was exhausted, and he became severely ill with a stomach ailment. And he ends up going to the hospital in London. And he's helped by his friend, King Edward VII, who was a good friend of Pingree's. It started out as a joke because internationally he was known. And he had come to London to talk, and people thought he looked like Henry VII, or King Edward VII. They looked alike. And so they became friends, Pingree and, yeah, it was kind of cute. Here's a cartoon. This was a cartoon. Here's Pingree and the king, and here they are both kings. But King Edward took care of Pingree and put him in the very best hospital he could, and had paid for his doctor to come over and really took care of him. But he died, and he died in London, and it was a sad day. Joe was with him, and he then had a funeral in Detroit, of course. He was called the idol of the people, and there was bunting everywhere, and thousands of people, and many of them were just giving dimes. They had a donation basket. A lot of the Poles and people that had very little money, there were lots of dimes in the gift-giving box. So that's a statue of Pingree done by Rudolph Schwartz, and it's in Grand Circus Park downtown. You can see it. It's a beautiful statue. And what's funny is right across from there is a statue of one of his enemies who said his statue looked too good, so he built a statue right across the street. And it never stops, right? But anyway, that's it. So, yeah.
For some reason, I keep thinking, was he governor and
The same time. He was. I didn't get into that. It's kind of complicated, but he was both. But the Michigan Supreme Court said, nah, that ain't happening. So, right. Are there any other questions? I'm happy to answer.
Is he buried down there?
I don't know where exactly. I say his mausoleum, but I never could find out where exactly it is. It's probably Elmwood Cemetery.
People living at Rose Point who are still related to him.
Yeah, really?
Ask them.
Yeah, that's
I went to
true.
school with Polly Pingree.
Huh? What's
I
that?
went to school with Polly Pingree.
Oh, was she a descendant of his? She was related?
Yeah.
Oh.
His great granddaughter.
Oh, I see. Okay, good, yeah. Good.
So they're there. You can go
They're
ask
there, yeah. I'm sure they know. Well, thank you very much for having a talk.